What a turnout.
Hello, everyone.
Wow. Welcome, everyone. I'm Sarah MacLean, and I'm so excited to be having this conversation in real time, in real person.
And in the Rare Book Room, of all places.
Yeah, exactly where it should be. So, Rebecca, this book is so gorgeous, and part of the reason why it is so gorgeous is because, not just because I love Austen and I love you and I love hearing what you have to say, but it's really a look at both Austen, this author who we both have loved for so long, and her favorites, and in many ways of you.
Yes.
So I wonder if you could talk a little bit, just give everyone a sense of how this project came to be.
Yeah, so initially Austen was the great unifying element. I said, I love Jane Austen. I think that her style is amazing. I feel like she must have great taste. If she has great taste, then the novels she likes must be good too, so I will read those. But then in the process of writing the book, I realized that the main through line, on the one hand, Austen was a sort of subject-based through line, but the main through line was me. Because I kept on having these moments where I reacted so strongly to a book, and I felt like I wanted to include that development and that reaction in the book, and it became a sort of bibliomemoir about how these books were transformative for me. And I felt like I really needed to include that in the book, and so it incidentally, not initially, but incidentally became very memoir-like because the focus on process was this sort of hidden, like, dark horse theme that more and more I just got committed to because I realized that the process and paying attention to that as the point as opposed to the end result. Like, is this book good or not? That's not nearly as important as actually giving it a try and having reactions in the moment and letting yourself react. That's the point, not, how many books you finished or whatever. So for me, that's how it accidentally became this theme that was mixed between, literary biography and criticism and collecting and these little bits of memoir.
So the book itself begins with this kind of idea that you repeat an idea, a myth that is oft repeated in Western culture, which is Jane Austen was the first one. She was the first woman to write commercial novels that people cared about. And then you very quickly show us that Austen herself would think that was a nonsense idea.
Yes.
And so I wonder, could you talk a little bit about the Northanger Abbey of it all and like that discovery?
Yes. So one of the big catalyst for this book was when I was on a house call and I came across a copy of a book that I had heard of before, but I had never considered reading. And it was this book, Evelina, by Frances Burney. And when I was doing research, cataloging it, I realized very quickly that she was one of Austen's favorite novelists, and specifically that Austen almost certainly took the phrase Pride and Prejudice from her second novel, Cecilia. And I was like, I did not know that. Why did I not know that? And on the one hand, before working on this book too, I'd handled works by Aphra Behn, for example, who is more traditionally called like the first professional English woman writer, way before the era of Austen. I had handled some of these other books, but I didn't stop to think about the idea of why was I not interested in reading Evelina? Why did I just dismiss it out of hand? Why did I say, okay, I'll sell this book, but I don't think it's worth my time to read. And the thing that was really stark for me was when I was reading about Frances Burney, I thought, okay, I'm learning about Austen, I'm learning who she liked to read. And I'm reading the list of all of the men that she liked to read, like Samuel Richardson, Samuel Johnson, Cooper, in terms of poetry. And I was like, I have read all of them. And then I'm reading this list of all the women that she likes to read, like Charlotte Smith and Charlotte Lennox and Anne Radcliffe and Frances Burney. And I had not read any of them at all. And so that's why I focused on women writers for this book, is because it was a correction to my own reading that I had accidentally, like, I was the sexist one here. Like, I was the one who initially came to this, and I was like, I completely ignored them. So I needed to correct. And that was a big part of why it came to be in the way it did, is because I realized that this mistake that I had made was a larger systemic mistake, and that scholars had been actually tearing apart these arguments for a long time in the academic world, and yet I, as a rare book dealer, was still making the same mistakes. And so I said, why?
And what's interesting about it is you say it when there, something I kept thinking about while I was reading your introduction specifically was this sense of, it feels even now in publishing and in the world, when we think about writers, we think about firsts, or like there's only room for one at the top if they're not a white cishet male. And so I wonder, like, how much of that felt, it doesn't change at all, it feels like, in a lot of ways. So could you talk a little about why you think it is that these women are not the one?
Right. So in every chapter, I sort of tease out the rise and fall, and in some cases rise again, of their reputation over centuries. And each of them have some different mechanisms and some bits that are overlapping. But the thing that happens over and over again is what you just described. It was, I think Katha Pollitt coined it as the Smurfette principle. Like, once we have the one, we've got Jane Austen, we're good. Like, check the box, we've got a woman, and you get one per generation.
Good. The books are entertaining.
Yeah, fine, good. And what happened was, for a long time, Austen was not the Smurfette. It was either Frances Burney or Maria Edgeworth. And Austen only really becomes the one that we choose in the late Victorian era. And so once that happens, you do see a shift for people like Edgeworth, who before then, she was said number one. When you have, for example, Austen's family members talking about how great Austen's novels were, that they deserve to be on the same shelf as Maria Edgeworth, or Madame D'Arblay, who is Frances Burney, now we do the opposite. We make them try to be on the shelf with her. And I'm like, why are we making them compete? Why is this like a death
big
match?
Shelf.
Yeah.
Big shelf.
And part of it is we're making them compete because we have limited time, right? Like, that's the purpose of canon, right? It's like, we can't read everything, so we have to make these decisions. We have to say, okay, I have to filter, I have to make the choice. Well, what if I don't know what to read? I don't know if I'll like it before I read it, obviously, so I want recommendations. Who better to get a recommendation from than authorities, critical authorities, people who read a lot of books and say these are the best, right? So canon being sort of a consensus of books that are worth reading far beyond the time that they've initially been published. It's meant to be an efficient way to say, you know, this book is good. So we know that about Austen, but what happens is the canon breaks down when we look at that as a wall, as an ending point rather than a starting point, right? It should be a yes and, not a yes but. So yes, Austen is a great writer, and so is Frances Burney. Not, Austen is a great writer, but Frances Burney's not as good as Austen, so why should I read her? So if you love Austen, it makes sense that you would want to try things more like Austen and not just lament like I did for so long. She only wrote 6 novels. I wish she wrote more. Well, Frances Burney wrote more, and Maria Edgeworth wrote more. Like, there's a ton more that you can explore.
And you say, you have this great line in the book that I underline that says, you know, and we have a really great recommendation for Frances Burney, which is Austen loved her.
Yes.
So can we talk a little about, and I think this is a 2-part question, because I think it's both, what did you learn about Austen through these women? How did you get a better, I feel like we can all, if we say to ourselves, like, who are the 5 writers who made us readers? That says a lot about us. Mm-hmm. And I wonder if you could speak to that. And then I'm going to ask you to do it for yourself as you went through them.
Mm-hmm. Okay. So one thing that I trace in the book is how I reread Austen differently after reading these books. A great example of that is Anne Radcliffe. So in Northanger Abbey, I didn't even get into the Northanger Abbey thing.
I'm just bringing you back around.
There we go, yes. So in Northanger Abbey is mostly summarized as a satire of Gothic novels. The basic premise of this novel is that there is a young woman who's sort of new to society, and she comes to Bath, and it's her first time really out in society, and she loves reading these Gothic novels, and she makes the mistake of sort of expecting real life to be like the novel she's reading, right? And that is true. That is absolutely in and part of Northanger Abbey. And also, there are all these extended passages in Northanger Abbey about the joys of reading. Like, so we can kind of satirize the idea of imagination versus reality, and we can also say, no, reading books is really joyful and fun. So there are quotes in Northanger Abbey about this book, The Mysteries of Udolpho by Anne Radcliffe. The main character, the heroine, Catherine Morland, says, while I have Udolpho to read, I feel like nothing could make me miserable. And the hero, Henry Tilney, says that he read Udolpho over the course of 2 days, his hair standing on end the entire time. Everyone loves this book. And so to say that Northanger Abbey is just making fun of this book is like a selective reading at best. In fact, Austen defends the novel. She even goes out of her way in Northanger Abbey to say, I am sick of people who say, oh, it's just a novel. Like, they'll brag about reading Milton, they'll brag about reading, you know, all these fancy canonical authors, but then they'll be ashamed or embarrassed to admit that they read novels, and I think that's silly. Like, she actually sort of breaks the fourth wall. She totally breaks form and just gets on a soapbox in the middle of Northanger Abbey. And when she does that, she actually names novels and says, these are amazing books. And that's actually how the parameters of the book got established, because she names 2 books by Frances Burney and a book by Maria Edgeworth, and that creates my bookends. And so what happened was I read The Mysteries of Udolpho, and then I read Northanger Abbey again, and that's when all of those aspects popped out at me, because I had loved Udolpho. And so when I was suddenly reading other people talk about it. I mean, you have that, right? So you suddenly are kind of sharing this moment of like, you love that book too? I was feeling that with these fictional characters. And so suddenly it just changed the emphasis. It's the same book, it's the same text, but that text is not static, it's dynamic, it's changing with me. And so Austen changed after I read these authors.
And the genre of it all too, right? This idea of, I kept coming back to, I write romance novels, and I kept coming back to the way romance lives, and genre fiction in general lives in pop culture. And here we were, and we talk all the time in romance about how Austen was a contemporary romance novelist,
yes.
right? And we are all in dialogue with each other. And here she was in dialogue with all these books that people would love. And I feel like that's a thing that really lives in pop
Yes.
genre.
Yes, and I mean, one thing I talk about a little bit in the book about this sort of like my own little soapbox about romance novels is that people tend to be like, oh, well, romance novels are formulaic. And I'm like, so's a sonnet. Like, so... Like, the point of a formula...
Put it on a T-shirt.
Yes. The point of a formula is that it allows you a framework in which to get incredibly nuanced and detailed in teasing out the themes that you want to tease out. And so that's the same thing that's happening with Austen, is she's working in an established framework. And that doesn't mean that she's not doing amazing things. It's all in her execution. It's not about originality. You know, in fact, it's beautiful that she's working in a tradition because she's in a dialogue with other artists.
And speaking to the real world in a way that many authors did not at the time. Can we talk about let's go into the romance of it all, because we met because you are a rare book stealer, and we met because you had collected this magnificent collection that is now at the Lilly Library of romances. And I am ashamed to say that though I was a collector of romance at the time, I did not think of myself as a collector,
right?
Capital C. Mm-hmm. And you changed the way I thought about book collecting, because I thought it was, you know, you collected books if you were wealthy enough to be able to afford a first edition Pride and Prejudice. And if you were not, then you were not. So could you talk a little bit about the democratization of book collecting?
Oh yeah, absolutely. My pleasure. No, so I mean, obviously, my career is as a rare book dealer, and so I'm working with collectors on a daily basis in addition to collecting myself. And I also co-administer a book collecting prize called the Honey Wax Prize, which is for women in the United States aged 30 and younger. It's an $1,000 cash award. We're opening up submissions, by the way, this week. So if you know anyone, send them our way. And it's through this practical experience of working with collectors that I can tell you that the headlines that you see of like $1 million Shakespeare folios, that's collecting, but most collectors don't collect that way. Most collectors are collecting much more like what's in the book, which is that you just have some topic that you personally are obsessed with. I make this joke, if like you can't figure out what you want to collect, what is the one topic that once you start talking about it, you're like friends and family, they love you, but their eyes start to glaze over and they're like, I need you to stop. That's what you should collect. And so I feel like so many people, that's who I'm really dealing with on a daily basis, whether it's the people who are submitting to the prize or it's the people I'm selling to. It's people who are just really passionate and obsessive about this one thing. And like, that's who I want to be interacting with on a daily basis. Like, that's the perfect job, right? And I think that a lot of what I try to do professionally is to break down those myths, because I think that the rare book world has a sense of being very gatekeepy and being very inaccessible, but because it has been so transformative for me, and because I have seen how meaningful it has been, collecting has been in other people's lives, I see it again on a daily basis, I want to make it clear, like invite as many people as possible into this. And there are a lot of examples too where my horizons have been broadened. Like I think about with our prize winners for the Honey and Wax Prize, people coming to us and saying, you know, I am a college student and I am a college dorm. You know, I can't have a big library like this. So I started collecting these pamphlets that were programs for the odori, like these annual geisha dance tea ceremonies in the 1970s. My whole collection fits into 2 shoeboxes. So my college roommate's not going to get mad at me. Or one of our winners, Emily Forrester, she was an artist and she was part of the fan-made comic scene. And so she built up this huge collection that she pretty much made through trade. She didn't even buy things because she would make her own comics and then she would trade them with other people in her community. Like, you don't even have to spend money necessarily. So whatever idea you have of like, oh, I can't collect because I don't have space. Oh, I can't collect because I don't have the money. Those limitations are not walls. They are opportunities to be creative.
And can you talk also about, I've heard you say magnificent things about we are all readers are sort of natural collectors. Mm-hmm. The books that we have in our home, we have, you know, multiple editions of one book that we really love.
That's a great sign. If you have more than one copy of your favorite book, I'm sorry, you're going to read both copies. No, you're collecting. That's what you're doing. Sorry, go on.
No, and you don't have to keep it in plastic. You know, in fact, right. Tell everybody about your plastic feeling.
No, so a Mylar sleeve, archival sleeve, that's one thing. But like, you don't actually want to leave your books in like, you know, plastic boxes or in Ziploc bags. Don't do that. That's not actually good. Books like air, you want circulation. You don't want them in your attic. You don't want them in your garage. Put them in the room where you live. Books are like people, okay? They like average temperatures. Just let them live.
And you are building your collection every time you dog-ear a page, flag it, write. I was telling everybody that earlier that I write in every book I have ever read. I write all over them. And it used to feel like it was a sin in book circles to do that, but I make the opposite argument. Yeah, exactly. I know, you're like, let me see that book.
Yes.
Which is covered in writing.
I was like, what did you do there? Yeah. No, I make this argument in the book that people think like, oh, I shouldn't touch the book. It should remain pristine. Book historians, though, really love to see marginalia because reader response is one of the hardest things to trace. Like we have, if you look back at like some of these books like The Mysteries of Udolpho, 1790s book, do you know how exciting it is to have a little bit of writing from a reader then? Like not just what the critics were saying, like we have that in printed sources. What was an average reader saying? Like I have this copy of Frances Burney's second book, Cecilia, and it's 5 volumes. It's very long, and it has the ownership signature of this woman named Bettina, and it's from 1780s, so she was probably the first owner of this book. And there are these red stains across 2 of the bindings and the leaves, like pink red stains, which normally you wouldn't ever want as a collector. Like that kind of, you're like, that's terrible condition. But Bettina makes a note in the 5th volume. She says, by accident, a strawberry fell onto the book, which has stained the leaves. And so, you know, this is 250 years later. I'm reading her note in the book. She's gotten to volume 5, and she's like so riveted. She's like eating
snacking
over it. Yes.
Very relatable.
Yes. And like, again, like book historians eat that up, right? I mean, we're eating it up. It's so good. And so that's what I mean is it's like, I think that when it comes to our response now, we get a little, we don't take it as seriously as I think that we could in terms of how book historians value it. They really do.
So the memoir piece of this is you then collecting these women and the works. And I wonder if you could share one of your favorite stories related to finding, because it must feel just magnificent when you find the thing you've been looking for.
It does. It does. It's funny that you say that, though, because the first thing that came to mind was one that got away. Like, of course, that's what you think of. I'd recently bid at auction on a first edition of Evelina, and I was outbid, and I am still very, very angry about it.
I hope you're not here.
Yeah, no, I know. Like, no, I've a couple times been outbid, and but
you tell so many great stories about going into rare book back rooms in rare bookstores, and it just feels like a novel in its own right.
Yeah.
And so, can you talk about one of those experiences?
Yeah, I think that a good example of this was a copy that I had gotten in a bookshop in London where I was looking for a Charlotte Smith novel. So Charlotte Smith wrote novels that Austen read when she was growing up, like when she was a teenager. And we know this because in Austen's Juvenilia, which is like her novel she was writing as a teen, she mentions these novels specifically and says, oh, I just love them. And I love Emmeline more than all the others. And that's Charlotte Smith's first book, Emmeline. So I wanted a copy of that. And I was looking for the right copy and looking for the right copy. And I was in this bookshop in London, and they had a copy that was in an unusual binding because it was this wealthy heiress, this woman who built a library that was mostly filled with women authors of her time. This is in the 1790s. And I was like, okay, first, that's just cool. And she literally puts her own monogram on the spines of all of the books. Like she has them custom bound, like Mary Hill. It's so cool. So I like that on its own. And then I realized too, like she has her ownership signature in it.
I'm sorry. Did you know who this was at the
time?
No.
I didn't. So when I was there and I was looking at the shop, and this is, this is a great rare book dealer. This is Quaritch in London, and they had a catalog description where they do the due diligence, and they actually say this is who Mary Hill is. And they mention quickly, they're like, she was also a subscriber to this copy or to this edition of Charlotte Smith's sonnets. And I was like, I have that book. And so I bought the Emmeline from them, and then I took it back, and when I got home, I had that copy of the elegiac sonnets. And the subscribers list, what it is it's kind of like a modern crowdsource project. You pay money up front in order to fund the project, and then when it gets funded, you get your name printed in the subscribers list as thanks, right? And so I go back and I have the subscribers list. I have the deluxe edition of Elegiac Sonnets, and I open it up, and there's Mary Hill's name printed in it, right? And so it was like this perfect thing of now I was putting these books together on the shelf. And you have moments like that where book collectors are big believers in the concept of serendipity, which is kind of like the idea of fate intervening in your life and allowing yourself to be open to be surprised and let that taking you where it will, rather than being directed in a sort of, very efficient way. I kind of talk about book collecting as an anti-algorithm activity, right? Just letting yourself be open to find books that, as one of my dealer friends says, books you never knew you wanted, but it turns out you do. So I think book collecting is a great activity just for that, about reminding yourself just to be open to possibilities around you.
So you've written about these women who inspired Austen, and I wonder if you could talk a little bit about, I'm going to put you on the spot and ask you about your favorite child, right?
Oh, no.
Can you share which one of these women inspired you the most and why?
Yeah, that's hard. I mean, I had very strong reactions to every woman in the book, and that's one of the reasons I chose them. There were other authors that influenced Austen, but I chose these 8 because I responded to them in some way very strongly. The one I talk about in the book is sort of being my favorite, the child of my heart, is Charlotte Lennox, because she is so bold and brazen, and she is bold when it costs her to be bold. Like, she just can't help herself. So Charlotte Lennox was one of the few authors in this book who really needed to make a living. Like, in this era, a lot of the authors who are writing, they actually, have some type of financial stability that allows them to not worry about, making money from these books. But there are a couple authors in this that really, this was the way that they survived. And Charlotte Lennox was one of those. And so for her, the stakes were very high. She needed to sell books. And even in that context, she still kept on challenging people and pushing people. So, for example, she first comes to fame for writing this poem called The Art of Coquetry, which is essentially the art of flirting. And it's, very brazen right out of the gate. And then her first novel features a heroine who when this man starts to assault her, she draws his own sword and stabs him with it. And I'm sorry, a Jane Austen heroine would never do that. Lennox is incredibly brazen, and I love that. And her book, The Female Quixote, which is a really important book that influences Austen, almost didn't get published because it was considered too racy, because it had a subplot of a genteel woman who had a child out of wedlock and who doesn't get terribly punished for it. And so there was an advanced reader who essentially tried to campaign to not get it published. And Lennox essentially only gets it published because Samuel Johnson and Samuel Richardson, two heavy hitters, advocate for her. And so she's constantly pushing, even though she had so much at stake. And I just really admired that.
And then you can sort of see the bones of that in Austen. I mean, obviously nobody grabs a sword and unfortunately. Yes, but you can see the child out of wedlock, the kind of edginess. Mm-hmm. Austen a little bit nodding to that over.
Yeah, you see Austen really digesting and processing a lot of these novels in ways that, as you say, she makes it her own. I was talking about Charlotte Smith earlier, and one of the big themes of Charlotte Smith's novels is don't marry young, because Charlotte Smith was married off at 15 to a guy who ended up being truly terrible. He was profligate, he was abusive, and by the time that they had 11 kids, he was thrown into prison for debt. You could be in prison for debt in this era. And that's how she started writing, was in order to pay first to get him out of debt, and then to pay to take care of her and the 12 children when she left him. She wrote for her freedom. And so a lot of the themes in Charlotte Smith's novels are don't get married young, don't just rush into things because it seems like it's economically feasible, because that was what the match was, is he came from a wealthy family, she came from a wealthy family. It's a perfect economic arrangement. And Charlotte Smith was like, that is not how you should be doing marriage. I can tell you that's terrible. Don't do it. And so you see Jane Austen processing things like that, in Sense and Sensibility and in Persuasion, about who is the right person to marry, especially in Persuasion, where that's a second chance romance, right? They actually do get married.
Forever, yeah.
Yes, she waits. But the thing that a lot of people ignore in that, when you say, isn't it a shame that they didn't the first time around, just she didn't have the courage to say, yes, we should have gotten married the first time around. No, Anne Elliot says very clearly, I was right to say no the first time. And that is straight out of a Charlotte Smith novel.
Well, and Austen's life.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. To say, no, I have to follow my conscience. Austen, this is a small biographical thing, but Austen did actually get proposed to and said yes, and then the next morning rescinded her yes. So, Austen herself lived things like this.
I'm still stuck on 11 children and still a writer. I have one and it's a lot, so... I want everybody to think about questions, because we're going to leave lots of time, and I know people always have questions for Rebecca. So, but I wonder, can we talk? I want to bring it back. I said I was going to ask you this question. So you did this remarkable work. You did all this collecting. You read these books, and what did you learn about yourself in the process?
What did I learn about myself? I mean, I would say I learned that I'm really opinionated, but I knew that already. Well, I do think that I developed a greater conviction for this idea of not apologizing for taste. Especially in the rare book world, where, the canonical novels, the classic ones, the idea of taste actually gets reflected in the marketplace a lot of the time. You know, those are the books that are more expensive in many cases. And to say, no, I like this, you know, tattered book that was published as a science fiction paperback, or, you know, you can buy copies of the first edition for $15 right now from, you know, 1960. The idea of saying that those things are equal to me because it's not about marketplace value, it's about my personal taste, and that's what I'm prioritizing. Like for me, when people ask, what should I collect? As I said, like, what do you love? That is a question that I think is a lot harder to answer than you realize, because you're going to answer it in two different ways. How do you think you should answer that versus how you really would? I saw this recently. This is something of a tangent, but it is related. There was like a trend online of people putting their like top 10 favorite authors. And a lot of the people I was seeing do this were just like Dostoevsky and James Joyce. And it was all like very literary canonical people. And then I was like, I'm going to do this list. And I was like, mine does have Dostoevsky on it. And it also has Jennifer Cruzy on it. And it also has Alona Andrews on it. And it has like, it was a mix of like very popular contemporary authors and the quote unquote classics. And I was like, this is true to me. And the enjoying that about myself, rather than being like, should I be embarrassed that Alona Andrews is on the same list as Dostoevsky? Absolutely not. I love them both. Like the idea of leaning into that and appreciating your own joy, I think, is a big part of what I learned in this.
Yeah. Also, I feel like the big emotional chaos of a Russian novel is very similar to a lot of those books that you just gave.
I like the drama.
Exactly. Big feelings. Big feelings. So I want to ask a question, and you don't have to answer it, but I am going to ask it anyway, which is, you talk with it's such a joy to watch Rebecca collect in this book. And I wonder if you have a white whale.
I mean, the Evelina thing is really, really upsetting to me.
It's fresh. It's raw.
It is. It is. No, I was very, very upset to miss that. That's probably one of the closest. The other white whale would be a book I talk about in it that I don't know where it is now. I think it's I have a couple guesses. Is in the Maria Edgeworth chapter, I open it talking about a book that came up at auction, and it was the presentation copy of Emma that Jane Austen sent to Maria Edgeworth. Oh, I want that so badly. So yeah, I can think of a number, but we'll leave it at that.
Yeah, that's good. That's good. I want to make sure that we have time for questions. So,
thinking about other influences, like where would something like, you know, Sarah Maas talks about reading fan fiction. Like where would that fit in your collecting spectrum? Or like Christina Lauren used to write fan fiction. Where would their fan fiction fit on that collection spectrum?
So I have interviewed collectors who collect fan fiction. So there are definitely collectors who that is their collection is fan fiction. In some cases, and what that means too is their collection is all digital as well. That's amazing. But that speaks to a big sort of value of the fan fiction community, is that like it is not commercial, right? You're not selling the work. You're not that's the ideal philosophically. And so that's where it gets very tricky for the rare book trade, is like I don't want to go onto, you know, like Etsy or TikTok or whatever and start buying up these fan bindings of this fanfic and then reselling them. Like for me that's murky, because that's sort of like fundamentally philosophically opposed to their creation. Yes. And also, I do know collectors who are specifically doing that, and I do know that there are institutions who are interested in working with those collectors to see that those collections are preserved long term.
Unfortunately, the topic I can go on and on and on about is Shakespeare. So what is a way that I can kind of nicheify my interest and perhaps start collecting in a game that has way too many zeros for my bank account?
So this book is perfect for you then, because I can't afford Jane Austen first editions either. I start very much right in the beginning. I say, I created a budget for myself. I have books that I collect for my business because in my business I can afford much more expensive books as long as I can buy them with the ability to resell them for more money. But when I'm buying for my personal collection, I have much more limits on my spending. And so a Jane Austen first edition is out of scope for me. So I love Jane Austen, but how do I do that? And one of the ways that I did it is I said, well, I'm really interested in these other authors that she influenced, that she loves. She loves Mariah Edgeworth. And let me tell you, I cannot believe how cheap some of these books were because no one else cared.
Not anymore.
I know.
We should have done this yesterday first, pregame.
No, I already did all of that. I got it. No, and so like the rare book marketplace works on supply and demand, right? How many copies survive and how much do people want it? And so if you are focusing on a high demand area like Shakespeare or like Austen, yeah, if you go for the first editions, a lot of people want it and the prices will be higher. But then if you say like, I'm really into Mariah Edgeworth, and you're like, who else has even heard of Mariah Edgeworth? Like, to start. Well, that demand equation is very different there. I mean, I found some books that like, I have multiple copies of Evelina that are incredible copies that I got for like $20 to $40 each, like price of lunch kind of situation. And these are great books. And it's just because I didn't have a lot of competition. So as I said before, don't use that as a limitation. Use it as a reason to get creative. So maybe you say, I want to collect like how Shakespeare appears in the titles of other works, right? So for example, Sound of the Fury, like there are so many different works that use Shakespeare in their titles. You could do an entire collection of that. Or you can do a collection of, I want to I want to collect romance novels that show readers reading Shakespeare. Like there are just so many different ways you can take the theme of Shakespeare and play with it and create a capsule collection on that theme without feeling like, oh, I just can't get a Shakespeare folio for $2 million. Or really, actually, it's more like 6, sorry. My bad.
What are some new collections you're working on?
No. Okay, so one of my favorite collections, and one I like to talk about a lot in this context of the sort of myth busting, is it's a romance collection, but it's really narrow. It is so in the 1960s there was this big trend of Gothic romances. It is what you might consider the women running from houses genre. And there was one particular publisher, Ace, that kind of pioneered that in a branding sense with this book called Thunder Heights. And I collect the Ace Gothic romances from the 1960s specifically. So not just any Gothic romances, not just Ace, but Ace, the earliest Aces in 1960, so about 1970. And I put a few other parameters on that because if you go on eBay, you can just find kind of slews of these, and I didn't want to make it too easy on myself. So in order to make it harder, in order to slow down the process, because again, the process is the point. That's why I'm doing it. I enjoy the process, so I'm going to make it even slower. I said I only want to buy really fine copies, which is very hard for post-war paperbacks. Like you read those one time and they fall apart. And I'm not going to pay more than $15 for a single volume. It's very hard to find a fine copy for under $15 of the Ace 1960s Gothic romances.
But it's partially the journey, right?
Well, exactly. Like that's why I want to do it. I like hunting for books. I just enjoy the hunt. And so I want to extend that, and I want to make it hard on myself, because that way when you find that thing, you're like, ah, and you jump on it, and it is so satisfying. And so, I could have just said, oh, I doesn't matter what I'll spend, and I'll just vacuum it all up now. But I want to avoid it feeling like a shopping list. I want it to feel much more like a treasure hunt.
This question is for Sarah. I was just wondering what your favorite Jane Austen book is, and if she has influenced your writing.
I think it's impossible for a romance novelist to answer this question without saying yes. Of course, she has influenced our writing, because I think she has influenced the whole family tree. Like she's in the root system, just like all these other women are. I feel like I have an answer that I should say and an answer that is true, and so I'm going to give you the truth, which is my favorite is Emma. In part because I find her really fascinating. She is so unlikable, like deeply unlikable. but also like really relatable and kind of lovely. Like there's so much complexity to her that I feel like, and I feel like my collection, the thing I would collect if I could collect anything is first novels from everyone, because I feel like your first novel is often the one that most reveals who you are. And she was so young, and there's so much about Emma that I feel like ultimately in Austen's life, she was so many of those characters, despite probably not wanting to be. But I also think, like I said, first novels. So for me, yes. And I also think Austen definitely influenced me in many ways. I think a lot of those of us who write historicals write Austen into our books, not the woman, but the text. Especially in the early days. I don't do that anymore because I did it. I did it in my first romance novel because everybody does it in their early books. And so, yeah, I mean, without her, I don't know that historical romance would be here.
Rebecca, what does adaptation look like for you of Jane Austen's work, encompassing this sort of fuller perspective of Jane Austen's reading life? How do you think that changes the equation? I know that's a very kind of loose question, but I'm curious about that.
Well, first of all, I will say on the topic of adaptation that Austen is blessed with one of the best ever book to movie adaptations, which is Clueless.
Yes, agreed.
So I think that's really all I have to say about that. But I mean, picking up actually on what Sarah was saying about how Austen's sort of like in the DNA of the romance novel, I did a list for LitHub too about like different authors that Austen has influenced, and one of the books I included was Pride, Prejudice, and Other Flavors by Sonali Dev. And this is a book it's a romance novel, contemporary romance novel. And obviously it's playing a lot with Pride and Prejudice and the themes in it. And it's also, its other big influence is Bollywood. And it's really like beautifully over the top in terms of like, you know, the themes specifically that are pulling not only from standard like Bollywood tropes, but also what's lurking in like Pride and Prejudice. So family connection is a huge one. The other thing, if you really like dislikable heroines, like it's one of the best dislikable heroines in that book. And so Austen can be fertile ground for people to do exactly what Austen herself did, which was look around at what's there and say, how do I make this mine? And that was very similar to what I was trying to do in my book too. When I thought about what book I wanted to write, I was like, I want to write something that only I could write. And so adaptations are, on the one hand, you know, tied to their source material, but I think every great adaptation has to stand on its own and be great on its own, and that's why Clueless is perfect. But I also agree, you know, that we do get caught on just the canonical authors for adaptation and the lesser known authors. Like Mysteries of Udolpho TV series, when? I need it now. So there is a sense that like part of this bid with using the canon as yes and is to say like there's a wider range here that's just waiting for people to get excited by if they only knew it existed. And so for me it's a kind of a complicated answer, but I think that the more that we lean into that richness and complexity, the more we're actually going to find joy and satisfaction.
So one of the things I was thinking about as I was listening to this was a few years ago when I saw the Amy Winehouse library that you had fully intact. And I've been curious, as I've been listening to you speak, about the differences in the sort of two paths of collecting that I have sort of traced in this project and in your work sort of writ large, which is like building a collection, but then also reconstituting and rebuilding a collection, and how the sort of detective work in both of those paths are similar and different. And specifically, what is it about putting together and rehabilitating this sort of like, you know, ghost of a former collection that is so satisfying an accompaniment to personal collecting?
So, the reference there was a few years back at my rare book company at Type Punch Matrix, we had acquired books from the library of Amy Winehouse, and we had acquired them at auction that as all disparate lots. They had broken up her library and were selling them off piecemeal. And when we saw that, we were like, no, when you look at the books that she had and how she interacted with them, how she wrote with them, on them, how she did, I'll talk about it, she did all sorts of really interesting things with them. You see that there's a larger story. I mean, that's what a collection really is that there's things that come out of it that are bigger than the sum of its parts. That's the point of it, is that suddenly when you get these books next to each other on the shelf, they start to kind of spark and they say something new that they didn't say individually. And so with the Amy Winehouse books, we reconstituted that because what we saw is when we put them next to each other, you got this biography of one of the great 21st century musicians writ through her books, because some of her books literally she had a brainstorm of all the guest lists to one of her birthday parties. She had one of them, it was a book about visiting grave sites, and there was one grave site where she had put a big kiss mark on it. And there was other ones where she literally was brainstorming lyrics to an unpublished song across the page from a poem that she was reading at the time. And so you see the story of someone's life through their books. And so, you know, when you think about someone like Amy Winehouse, whose life is often seen as like this arc of tragedy, and then you see the richness of a life as an artist through her books, it's a different story. And they both can be true, but it's beautiful to see it that way. And so the idea of putting that collection together again was to make that message stay intact because we thought it was important. And so there was a little bit of that in the Jane Austen bookshelf, in that I wanted to obviously recreate Austen's bookshelf. But very quickly, it became, you know, as much a reflection as me of anything else, because I started getting so interested in, okay, I've answered this first question, like, are these books any good? Like, Austen liked them, are they any good? I read them, I think they are. The next question becomes, well, then why don't we read them anymore? And that question extended beyond Austen's lifetime. It gets into the Victorian era and the, you know, rise of modernism in the 20th century. And that becomes a very different story and a very different arc. And so the collection takes on a life of its own. And so, yes, they are slightly different types of collecting, but both of them speak to the fundamental theme that when you put these books together, they spark and they say something bigger.